England is one of the four countries that make up the UK, along with Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. It's by far the biggest in terms of size and population. For centuries, England has been the most powerful and developed nation in the British Isles, using its economic and military strength to influence its neighbors. But you might be surprised to learn that, for a big part of its early history, England was actually influenced by lots of other nearby cultures. England has been a melting pot of languages and cultures since prehistoric times, with waves of migration and conquest shaping its unique identity over thousands of years. But how did this relatively small country end up not only influencing the future of the British Isles, but also shaping much of the modern world we live in today? This is the story of England. Shaped by countless political upheavals, wars, and invasions over the past several centuries, probably the most iconic and defining being World War II, we all know the Allies eventually won. The land that would eventually become England looked totally different to the first humans who settled there during the Stone Age. Back then, the British Isles weren't even islands. They were connected to mainland Europe by a land bridge. Around 11,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended, melting ice sheets made sea levels rise, which, later, the low-lying land bridge called Doggerland got flooded, permanently cutting Britain off from Europe. Even though Britain was separated from the mainland, people in Europe and those living in what would become England kept trading and sharing culture. Farming, which started in the Middle East, was introduced around 4000 BC, and the first permanent settlements appeared, featuring big tombs and ceremonial stone circles like Stonehenge. Built around the time when the Stone Age was turning into the Bronze Age, England mostly stayed similar to the rest of Britain and Europe. Similar cultural and language habits were brought over by waves of migrants from the continent, which eventually developed into the Celtic culture. By the 12th century BC, this culture was widespread across much of Western Europe. Life for the Celtic people in England carried on pretty much the same way for the next several centuries. It wasn't until 55 BC that a totally new kind of invasion force showed up on the southern coast. The Roman Republic, which would later become the Roman Empire, was the top dog in the ancient world, having spread all over the Mediterranean and recently pushed north into what's now modern France. The Roman general behind this recent takeover, called Gaul back then, was none other than Julius Caesar. Pretty soon, Caesar set his sights on conquering the lands across the English Channel. The first invasion didn't do much besides landing the army on the coast. So, the next year, in 54 BC, they launched a bigger invasion. This time, the Roman legions pushed as far as the northern bank of the River Thames. Even though they had some success, the Romans couldn't secure a permanent hold on the island and eventually pulled back across the channel. Still, the Romans believed the island could and should be conquered, and nearly 100 years later, Emperor Claudius took on the challenge. It was decided to launch a well-planned and organized invasion in 43 AD. Over the next few decades, Rome's legions pushed across the land, taking control of almost all of what we now call England. They set up many towns along the way, including London, Chester, and York. Even though Rome's rule was sometimes challenged by local uprisings, like the one led by Queen Boudica in 60 AD, England stayed a key part of the Roman Empire for several centuries. The northernmost border was set with the building of Hadrian's Wall. Like all empires, Rome's rise and fall was bound to happen. By the early 5th century, its power and influence had seriously declined. The last Roman legions left England in 407 to protect the more important parts of the empire on the continent, which were under threat from various migrating barbarian tribes. Some of these tribes soon started focusing their attention elsewhere. Heading to England, these Germanic tribes, later known as the Anglo-Saxons, kicked off a chain of events that would shape the language, culture, and history of the English people. They first moved to England sometime in the 4th century, probably working as mercenaries for the Roman army. By the mid-5th century, a good number of them had settled in the eastern part of the country. Exactly how this all happened is still up for debate. Historians argue about this. Some say there was a big invasion that violently pushed out the native Celtic people, while others think it was a more peaceful, slow process where cultures mixed over time. Either way, the Anglo-Saxons took over the Romano-British language, culture, and people with their own Germanic customs and lifestyle. The language they brought eventually evolved into the English we speak today, even though the Anglo-Saxons shared the same language, culture, and religion. They were. By the 7th century, the native Britons had pulled back to the far western parts of the island, like Wales and Cornwall, setting up their own independent kingdoms. Meanwhile, the 7 Anglo-Saxon petty kingdoms, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex, became the foundation of a separate, though still divided, English nation. Over time, the Anglo-Saxons switched from their old Germanic pagan beliefs to Christianity, and began. They were all trying to grab power for themselves, often fighting each other as well as the nearby British kingdoms to the west and the Picts and Scots to the north. By the late 8th century, the feuding Anglo-Saxons had merged into 4 bigger kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. But the very survival of Anglo-Saxon England was soon in doubt when fleets of Viking longboats suddenly started showing up off the coast. The Viking Age in England is widely known to have begun around this time with well-documented raids. The raid on the Northumbrian monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 marked a significant event, although smaller raids had already been happening across England and other parts of the British Isles. What started as occasional attacks on isolated, treasure-filled monasteries went on well into the next century. But in 865, the Vikings changed their game plan, from quick hit-and-run raids to full-on conquest and occupation. Late that year, a huge Viking army landed in southeast England with that goal in mind. Taking over the lands of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, this huge Viking army, called the Great Heathen Army in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, first marched north and took control of Northumbria in 867, then East Anglia in 869, and Mercia in 874. That left only Wessex as the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, led by King Alfred. So far, Wessex had managed to avoid the Viking raids either by fighting them off or paying them to stay away. But by 878, the Vikings had taken over most of the area. Wessex pushed Alfred into hiding, threatening his kingdom and the future of England. But King Alfred managed to gather an army for one final stand against the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in May that year. He won. Because of this, he earned the nickname the Great, by driving the Vikings back east to the lands they still controlled under Dane law. With the Anglo-Saxons back in charge, the kings of Wessex slowly started reclaiming the rest of England. Alfred's grandson, Aethelstan, took over the Viking-held lands and conquered the Kingdom of York in 927, calling himself the King of the English for the first time. This new, united, and powerful Kingdom of England really worried the nearby rulers in the British Isles, who then teamed up with Vikings and Scots to try to take down Aethelstan. In 934, the Battle of Brunanburh happened, one of the most important battles ever fought in the history of the British Isles. Ethan's army won the day, securing England's independence and dominance that would last for most of a century. But by the turn of the new millennium, England's kings had grown complacent, and the threat from marauding Danish Vikings popped back up. Over the next few decades, the English throne switched hands between Anglo-Saxon and Danish rulers. At one point, the kingdom was even part of a bigger Scandinavian North Sea empire under King Canute. By the year 1042, the House of Wessex was restored to the throne under King Edward the Confessor, but since he didn't have an heir, England's future was uncertain, with lots of people claiming they should be next in line. When Edward died in 1066, the powerful English noble Harold Godwinson took the throne, which really upset Duke William of Normandy. King Harold also had to deal with claims from Harold of Norway and King Sweyn II of Denmark, who both said they had rights to the crown too. The events of 1066 would. It without a doubt, one of the most important moments in English history and completely changed the country forever. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in September that year saw King Harold Godwinson beat an invading army led by the Norwegian king. But just a few weeks later, his tired troops had to quickly march down south to face another invasion, this time led by Duke William. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, is probably the most famous date in English history. King Harold was reportedly killed by an arrow to the eye, which led to the end of the Anglo-Saxon line of kings. They were replaced by the new Norman French dynasty, started by William, who crowned himself King of England on Christmas Day that year. The Norman Conquest completely changed how England was ruled, especially after William crushed numerous English uprisings and took control over the neighboring Welsh kingdoms. King William I of Scotland ordered the Domesday Book to take stock of the land, people, and money in his kingdom. The finished survey revealed that almost all the Anglo-Saxon nobility had been replaced by Normans, who brought French as the language of the ruling elite. From then on, England's future was forever linked with France, since many of England's lords also owned lands across the Channel. The Norman dynasty lasted. About 80 years later in England, another succession crisis sparked a civil war between Henry I's rightful heir, Empress Matilda, and the noble's chosen favorite, Stephen of Blois. Stephen ended up ruling as king until he died in 1154, after which Matilda's son, Henry II, took over. Henry II was a descendant of both the Norman and Plantagenet noble houses, and through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he ruled not just England but also parts of Wales and Ireland, but also over a huge part of western France, which would later be called the Angevin Empire. England was ruled by the Plantagenet kings for most of the medieval period but went through a lot of ups and downs. From the late 12th century to the mid-13th century, for example, was a time of disasters and political chaos as they lost a lot of their lands in France because of conflicts with the French kingdom. The fallout from this caused serious problems among the powerful English barons, leading to a rebellion. King John's signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 limited the king's absolute power, but despite this, civil war between the king and the barons went on for much of the century. It only ended when King Edward I took the throne in 1272. Edward boosted his government's power by opening the first Parliament and greatly expanded English control in the British Isles by conquering Wales and trying to do the same elsewhere. As the 14th century began, England kept fighting expansionist wars with its neighbors, especially against France. This kicked off the long, drawn-out 100 Years' War. During King Edward III's reign, England scored big wins at the battles of Crécy and Poitiers. But soon, the fighting stopped because a totally different and deadlier threat was about to hit England's shores, the Black Death, which started in Asia and spread everywhere. In the late 1340s, the plague came to England on a ship from English-controlled Guinea in 1348. In less than 2 years, the plague had spread across the whole country, killing up to half the population. This not only cut down the number of men available for England's armies, but also caused big social and economic changes. The peasants who survived had to deal with rising taxes to fund expensive wars, but they weren't being paid enough. They wanted fair pay for their work, which was in higher demand than ever. These tensions finally exploded into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, with protests all over the country but mostly in the southeast. Rebels marched on London and killed lots of government officials they blamed for their problems. Order was eventually restored, but England stayed unstable. The unpopular King Richard II was overthrown in 1399 by his cousin, who took the throne as King Henry IV. More crises and uprisings followed. His reign faced many troubles, but they were mostly crushed thanks to the military efforts of his son and successor, Henry V, who took the throne in 1413. Under King Henry V, England went through some of the most defining moments in its history, like restarting the 100 Years' War with France and the incredible victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, which became a legendary part of English history. However, Henry's early death in 1422 marked a downturn for England, leaving his infant son, Henry VI, as king. He inherited the throne, but his reign was marked by a series of defeats for France in the ongoing conflict, ending with the English being pushed out of almost all their territory by 1453. Henry VI's position got worse in the following years as the feuding nobles grew restless, sparking another civil war in 1455 called the Wars of the Roses, named after the symbols of the two branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, the white rose for York and the red rose for Lancaster. The fighting went on intensely for the next 30 years until Henry Tudor, the very last surviving male of the Lancastrian line, came back from exile in France and beat the Yorkist King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. After that, England moved into a time of relative peace because the houses of Lancaster and York were united through King Henry III's marriage to Elizabeth of York. This kicked off the Tudor dynasty. The war-torn economy slowly started to recover, and the new ideas from the Renaissance began to take hold. Italy became known in English society when Henry VII died in 1509. His son, Henry VIII, took over. At first, his reign looked promising, but it soon turned into a reign of tyranny and became one of the most chaotic periods in English history. This was mostly because he desperately wanted a male heir. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon only gave him one surviving daughter, Mary. When the Pope refused to grant him a divorce, Henry decided to break away from the Catholic Church and he set up his own Protestant Church of England, which caused a lot of religious chaos in the country and eventually sparked a period of intense religious conflict that lasted nearly 100 years. Henry VIII's later marriages and hopes for a string of male heirs didn't go much better. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, was executed after giving birth to just one daughter, Elizabeth. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died from complications after having a son named Edward. His fourth marriage to Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves ended in divorce. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was executed for cheating on him. His sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, was the only one who outlived him, keeping both her reputation and her head intact because Henry died in 1547. He was succeeded by his only son, Edward VI. Under Edward's rule, England became much more Protestant, but his reign was short-lived. He died of tuberculosis in 1553. After that, his half-sister Mary took the throne. She was married to King Philip II of Spain and was a devout Catholic. Queen Mary, a Catholic, saw the last English stronghold in France fall to the French in 1558. But her reign was mostly marked by her harsh efforts to undo the Protestant Reformation in England. She brutally persecuted anyone sticking to the Protestant faith, with about 280 people burned at the stake under her rule, which earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Even though she was married, she didn't have any children, so when she died in 1558, the English throne went to her half-sister. Under Queen Elizabeth, England entered a golden age of prosperity. The Protestant Church of England was re-established, and Catholics were granted a bit of religious tolerance. The government got a lot stronger thanks to new laws and better administration, which helped the population grow a lot, reaching about 5 million by the early 1600s. Elizabeth's reign also saw a big boost in art and literature. People like William Shakespeare created some of the country's U.S. most famous plays that are still popular today. At the same time, England saw a big boost in its economy and military strength, mostly thanks to expanding trade in the Americas and Asia. Guys like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake helped England become a major sea power by leading expeditions to newly discovered lands. Parts of the world and successfully defended England during its darkest hour against the Spanish Armada in 1588. However, Elizabeth died childless in 1603, so the throne went to her closest male Protestant relative, King James VI of Scotland from the House of Stuart. He then became King James I of England through the union of the crowns. Even though he was king of both countries and ruled almost the whole island of Britain, The two kingdoms stayed separate. Early in James's reign, he faced a lot of challenges, the most famous being the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, where some unhappy English Catholics tried to blow up the king during the opening of Parliament. It was also around this time that the first permanent English colonies were set up in places like America and India, which later became the foundation of the British Empire. The later years of King James's reign saw growing tensions with Parliament over how the country should be governed. These problems really blew up during the rule of his son, Charles III. Arguments over power, religion, and how the country should be run, along with King Charles I refusing to work with Parliament, caused a lot of tension between the two main power groups in England. Finally, in 1642, things got violent, and the English Civil War started, fought between the king's supporters, known as Royalists, and the Parliament supporters, called Roundheads. Fierce battles like the ones at Edge Hill, Marston Moor, and Naseby were crucial in deciding the outcome of the war. It ultimately ended in victory for the Parliament's new model army, led by Oliver Cromwell. Because of his part in letting the country fall into a messy civil war, King Charles I was executed in 1649. For a short time, England became a republic with Cromwell in charge. The monarchy was brought back in 1660, though, when King Charles II returned to London. With his power greatly weakened, the country was still fragile after the Civil War. Then, in the mid-1660s, London was hit hard by two major disasters: the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of 1666, which caused massive damage to the capital. Charles II's reign ended when he died in 1685, and his brother James II took over. But that quickly sparked political turmoil because James was a devoted Catholic, and there were rumors he wanted England to go back to the old faith. Political groups quickly pushed for his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, Prince William of Orange, to take over in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. In November 1688, William landed with an invasion force on England's south coast, but didn't want to fight a big battle, thinking James II's government would fall apart on its own. That's exactly what happened. James fled to France, leaving the throne open for William and Mary to become king and queen together. Despite James seeming to give up, he still had some backing in Ireland and decided to start a military campaign there, hoping to get back on the throne. However, James was defeated by King William III's forces in battle and had to flee to France once again. The Catholic House of Stuart in exile kept posing a threat to England's political setup well into the next century. Meanwhile, England settled into relative peace under William and Mary's rule. They both accepted the Bill of Rights in 1689, which seriously cut down the king or queen's power by recognizing Parliament's authority and control. This happened during Queen Anne's reign, after she inherited the throne from her sister Mary. The English and Scottish parliaments were then officially joined into one, creating the Parliament and Kingdom of Great Britain through the Acts of Union in 1707. Queen Anne was the last monarch from the Stuart dynasty, and thanks to a new law at the time, only Protestants were allowed to become regent. When she died, the crown went to her distant second cousin, the German Prince George of Hanover. From then on, England's history wasn't about an independent sovereign nation anymore. Instead, it became one of the four nations that made up the United Kingdom. Under the Hanoverian kings in the 18th century, England, and Britain as a whole, started turning into a modern nation-state. Growing commerce and trade pushed the country forward, becoming the top global maritime power of the time. Supported by the Royal Navy's military strength on the high seas, Britain's colonies also grew more important during this period. However, losing America in the War of Independence seriously hurt the country's reputation worldwide. The only real threat at home came from the descendants of the exiled House of Stuart living in France, who tried and failed to overthrow the British government during the Georgian era. The monarchy was challenged twice in what became known as the Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745. In the 19th century, Britain rose to become the world's top superpower, thanks to the Industrial Revolution's innovations. These boosted the country's economy and helped the British Empire expand even more, eventually becoming the largest empire in history. The 20th century, however, was shaped mainly by the events of the First and Second World Wars. The World Wars almost bankrupted the country and kicked off the decline of Britain as a global power. Over the last 2,000 years, history has definitely shaped modern England, with its people descended from the different groups that came here over time. While you might not see the effects of all this history today, its influence is probably more obvious in the English language we speak now. Today, whether it's words borrowed from Latin by the Romans, the Germanic tongue of the Anglo-Saxons, Old Norse from the Vikings, or French from the Normans, England's language is the result of constant change and adaptability by its speakers. That's probably why it's become the most spoken language in the world. Big thanks again to Call of War for sponsoring this video. This free online PvP World War II strategy game lets you jump into epic battles and conquer the world. Click the link. Check the video description to grab 13,000 gold and a free month of premium, then fight your way to victory.